Thank you very much, NPC. This is a rare example of a roundtable event taking place on a round-ish table. I think you've done very, very well. I was at a roundtable event with a distinctly square table last week. Anyway, I was so pleased to get this invitation because it's actually I do quite a lot of public speaking in the role that I have, and it's largely to audiences of investors, which is all very well, but it's actually just really nice to sort of come home almost to speak to a civil society audience. I myself have only ever worked in civil society. I'm passionately committed to civil society, but I'm also, I really believe in challenging civil society to sort of step up and be more impactful and indeed play the role that I think one of our key roles in society is challenging other bigger and arguably more powerful actors to do the right thing by the many, many constituents and beneficiaries that all our different organisations work with. So I've been at ShareAction for 14 years as the chief executive. The organisation was very, very young when I joined, and it had been formed just a couple of years earlier in 2005 by a set of civil society organisations who wanted to create a sort of specialist NGO that would focus on holding accountable major investors to think about their impacts on society and on the environment. And so I'll say a teeny bit about our work as I go through this presentation. But just to say that ShareAction wouldn't exist if it weren't for kind of some quite enlightened and entrepreneurial thinking. And we're still governed today by a set of civil society organisations who are our member organisations and who vote our trustees in every year at our annual general meeting. And Oxfam is one of them, and Greenpeace is another, and Amnesty International. So we are a creature of civil society, accountable to civil society, and I think driven by the purposes and goals of civil society. But slightly unusually and distinctly, I suppose, we face into the investment in corporate communities and have had a very interesting journey over the last 15 years because ESG, which was a bit of a sort of very, very Cinderella, unknown term actually, the terminology is new, but that was all very fringe 15 years ago, and that's really not the case today, which I suppose is a good sign that we've perhaps collectively, all of us, had some impact. So I will just share a few reflections on how I see civil society's role in the economy. I think we have a very distinctive and special role in the economy, and that what we do is completely vital to a flourishing society and a successful economy that delivers for everybody. So often we're called the third sector, and my old boss in the organisation I worked for before ShareAction, which was Citizens UK, used to say, no, we're the first sector, which I think he's quite right. And in historical terms, he's very much right. But we do kind of get called the third sector because we're a bit smaller. But I think despite being small, we're very mighty. So in terms of our economic contribution, there's about 168, probably more since those stats are maybe a couple of years old, registered charities. The work that goes on in the sector represents 1% of GDP, 150,000 employees, which is about 3% of the workforce. But I think those stats really do not capture the significance of our role in the economy, because at our best we are there to guard and promote and uphold society's best values and challenge those to be embedded right across the economy. So I think that's something that ultimately civil society has this role to be guardians of what's best in the economy and a more just vision of the economy. And anyway, we also mobilise millions of hours of volunteering and service in ways that's critical to sustaining and supporting activity right across the economy. Those numbers are not captured in GDP stats, but they're really critical to enabling companies and public bodies and all sorts of agencies and of course supporting families. So that role is kind of rather invisible in the numbers, but imagine what would happen to our economy if that was withdrawn in any way. So that's just an crucial, empowering and enabling function that we play. But also I think we at our best, we're also identifying and meeting critical needs in society, often in leading and innovative ways. So we are social entrepreneurs often in our sector, and others come in and copy, typically often providers private providers. But it's civil society that's always on the frontiers of identifying those needs. And then thirdly, and this is sort of a bit where ShareAction is a bit of a specialist, I think as a sector we help to shape behaviours and outcomes by holding powerful economic actors to account for their impact on people and planet. And that is one of the ways that the civil society sector has an absolutely outsized influence and impact on the wider economy. So I hope you've got a sense of how proud I am of what we do in civil society. But of course, none of this is easy, and it takes great skill and it takes great discernment. And I'll come on to a bit of how I think we can play that role even better. But I'm going to just pivot to talking a bit about the rise of this thing, ESG, environmental, social and governance. I'm absolutely amazed, incidentally, at how this acronym has taken off. I thought it would die a death because it's a bit clunky, I think. But it seems to be used absolutely everywhere. Anyway, on the right of my slides here, I have a graph which shows you the Principles for Responsible Investment, which is the global sort of guardian of ESG investing in the global investment community. And the yellow line shows you the growth in investment organisations that have signed up to these Principles for Responsible Investment, which is a set of sort of effectively ESG principles. The principles include integrating ESG considerations into your investment process, being an active owner of the companies in your portfolio to really encourage them to do well on ESG factors. One of the principles is about collaboration and spreading the gospel of ESG. And so you sign up to these 6 principles and look how, that's an incredible success. And the Principles for Responsible Investment is, like ShareAction, 16 years old. And it's just been an amazing journey. That said, there is a great deal of controversy emerging around the issue of greenwash, for example. And as funds pour into the ESG space, just last year, the money held in sustainable and ESG-focused funds grew by astonishing 53%. And Bloomberg Intelligence is estimating that ESG assets, investment assets run with ESG principles designed in, will be a pool of 40 trillion by the end of 2022. That's a quite staggering amount of the world's pension assets and other invested funds and charities funds and so on. And all of this is, of course, making a great deal of money for the investment industry. It's at boom time, ESG. Everyone's piling in, and the industry is earning huge profits and generating enormous fees from this growth and interest in ESG. And it's not only appropriate to be a little bit concerned about that, but I think it's a really important part of what we do is to scrutinise, is this just a bandwagon? Is this just exploiting the fact that both organisations and individuals, as they see the real issues in the world, whether it's climate change or grotesque inequalities or health inequalities, and people really want to, both institutions and individuals, really want to invest in ways that addresses those issues and tackles them. And is the investment industry just offering them something that is, not the real deal, but feels good and is actually having rather minimal impact? So one of the things that's going on in the space at the moment is a great deal more regulatory interest. So the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the UK's main financial regulator, is actually very concerned that there's a sort of mis-selling scandal in the making around ESG funds. and that people are maybe buying things in the hope that they're going to do something that they're in no way, shape or form designed to really deliver or do. So I really welcome all of this challenge. I both welcome the growth of ESG funds because we're dedicated to it as an organisation, and we think that we can't solve society's greatest challenges without mobilising finance at scale, without activating the biggest companies, and without the contribution that civil society has to make in pointing the way on all of that. At the same time, we don't want to see people being missold products and it all being a bit of a sham. And then there are other interesting kind of trends and currents at the moment. So just lately, the kind of American right, the Republican Party, has decided that ESG investing is the devil's own work, and it's their number one kind of thing that they get really hot and bothered about. And interestingly, Elon Musk, who's obviously the CEO and founder of Tesla, which is an enormous success story in terms of being an electric vehicles company, but gets very bad grades on various ESG scoring systems, partly because he's such a maverick and their corporate governance is deemed a bit of a disaster area. And so he's really come out saying ESG is a load of old nonsense, and so does and the state of Texas, for example, which is a very Republican state, has said, well, we won't invest any pension assets with fund managers that are taking too much of a kind of a pro-climate action line. So it's suddenly becoming really quite a divisive political topic, which is, I have to say, somewhat regrettable, but on the other hand is interesting. And I that old adage, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they come after you. It does feel a bit like that at the moment in the ESG space. So that's a bit of what I see going on in the bigger ESG space. But now let me just share a few thoughts on why it is so important, in my view, that civil society is a champion of a financial system that does a better job of serving our planet and its people. Because for all the rise of ESG, which I've just described, as everyone knows, global emissions continue to rise. Our natural world is in steep decline. Biodiversity loss is a huge crisis. And the divide between the rich and poor, whether it's on in terms of health inequalities or income inequalities or other kind of access to opportunities, is as wide and as growing as ever. So in our view, and perhaps this is something we can all debate together in a bit, a lot of these challenges are directly connected to the fact that our economic system is still one where profits are frequently maximised at the expense of both nature and of vulnerable people in our society. And a major driver of that continues to be investment decisions that focus on short-term returns, encourage companies to externalize environmental costs and social costs, rather than doing their bit to really, whether it's in environmental terms, clean up after themselves, or to really protect the many different stakeholders that they interact with, whether it's consumers. I'm going to talk a bit about health in a moment as a key ESG issue that I think has been a bit neglected. One of the things we've done at ShareAction, I'll speak about in a minute, is really focus on diets and the huge food companies that churn out cheap foods that are high in sugar, fat and salt. That's cheaper, that's more profitable, huge costs on society. So those are just, and the investment community is conflicted here, because in the short term, those can be very profitable strategies. On the other hand, there's a more and more recognition that a lot of that drives investment risk. It can do, because you can get regulation coming in, and also if you hold a portfolio, a very, very diversified portfolio, then if you export costs in one area of your portfolio, or some of your companies do, those costs are picked up by other companies in your portfolio. So it becomes a kind of a bit of a lose-lose. So these are, in my view, some of the reasons why it is so important for civil society to play this role in demanding a more ambitious, more authentic and more impactful approach to ESG. And it's worth saying that the definition of responsible investment that is embedded in the principles for responsible investment that I mentioned a few minutes ago is one that actually says responsible investment is about managing the risks to me as a financial entity of social and environmental problems. It is actually not, if you look at the text of it, about taking responsibility for the impact that you have as an investor on society and environment. So it's an extraordinarily self-serving, inward-looking and self-centered definition is sort of underpinning this 15-year-old journey. So one of the things we think is needed is a kind of pivot to a more ambitious approach or definition of responsible investment, and that no one but civil society can really be the guardians or the champions of that. It's an incredibly important role for us in the ESG space. So now just turning to the topic which was about the S of ESG, I do think after a long, long period of focus, almost excessively dominant focus on climate, it is an existential challenge, and it's one that will affect all of us in every part of our world. But it's nice to see a slightly more balanced approach beginning to take place. And I think the pandemic has helped to catalyse that. And then even more pressing perhaps is the cost of living crisis, which I think is really going to change the emphasis in the coming year, and will require institutional investors to think really hard about the impacts of their portfolio companies on people who will be, and already are manifestly struggling to get by in some very, very basic ways. These are things that we in civil society are experts in. We're exposed to working with communities that are really struggling with some of these issues. And so I think it's a really good moment to bring the insights and the passions and the commitments and the expertise in civil society into playing a part in really informing the investment community and also challenging the investment community and the corporate community. So on the right, I've just got a list of sort of some of the ESG issues that are, the S issues that are beginning to get a bit more attention. They've always been around. Labour practices, wages and rights is obviously central. Human rights more broadly, equality and diversity, health and safety, consumer health, responsible marketing, responsible corporate tax practice. Some people put that in the G, but I think it's an S thing ultimately because it helps to pay for the things that societies need and to look after the vulnerable. Respect of land rights, data privacy. That's part of the challenge, is that when people say the S, they start to get immediately bewildered about a huge range of issues that could cover. And let me just give you some of the reasons that investors highlight as why the S is so difficult. So on the one hand, people are saying, well, the social performance and the social impact of companies are less financially material than the environmental questions. I'm not sure that's really true, but it is a kind of given out there in the investment community that climate issues are financially material. I think to a large degree that's because people have been told that they are. So, Mark Carney, after leaving the Bank of England, went on an incredible kind of global tour, whipping up the investment community, and good for him, to go along to the conference of the parties in Glasgow in November and make all these commitments on the premise that climate issues are very financially material and they could really come back and bite these financial institutions in the bum financially. And so that case has been made for climate issues, and that case has been made with less conviction for social issues. But I would argue that social questions have every bit as much potential to be difficult and damaging and risky from a financial point of view than environmental issues. But that's the orthodoxy. And then it's the second one is about it's too difficult to know where to start. There's just such a blizzard of S issues. Where do we go? What do we choose? That's also held up as a problem. And then the third one is we haven't got the data. We don't know. How could we possibly get started on this when we haven't got the data? That is always thrown up as a reason. There are data challenges, and I'll come on in a minute to something we're doing to try and address some of them. But I often say, well, it also becomes a very convenient excuse. We haven't got enough data to do things. I mean, if these issues if they matter to your stakeholders and they might be financially material, you get on and do something about them in the absence of perfect data sets. And indeed, the art of investing has always been one of making decisions in the absence of perfect information sets. That's what active management is all about, making judgments. So I think those reasons are all ones that could quite swiftly get blown away in the context of greater social demand for attention by investors to these questions. I just thought I'd quickly mention a piece of work that we did a couple of years ago to benchmark the 75 largest fund managers in the world on their responsible investment performance, their ESG performance. And what we found was that on the whole, these very, very large asset managers, and by the way, these are the huge, sophisticated firms, no excuses really for kind of neglecting really, really key issues. They have vast staffs, everyone's very well paid, I can assure you, yet the human rights is a kind of completely Cinderella issue for most of them. So although 76% of them did mention the words human rights somewhere in their investment policy, only 4% of the group that we looked at, and these are the largest firms, had a proper dedicated policy which could, really showed how they would actually apply human rights due diligence to the companies in their portfolio. And just 9 would systematically identify the negative impacts on human rights that may result from their investments. And most were taking a reactive approach. So if there was a sort of big blow up in the news about a company being exposed to some kind of ghastliness somewhere in the world, human rights abuse, then they would start asking some questions, but a more proactive approach. So I think that just goes to, obviously this is 2 years ago, and one thing I will say is that in 2 years, everyone's made amazing progress because this is so topical now, and there is so much expectation and pressure from clients of these asset managers, including clients in the charity sector who are doing amazing work, I have to say, to really push their managers to be more ambitious and to say what they're doing. But regulators as well. At the moment, the UK financial regulators are totally focused on the E rather than the S. I hope that will change. So this is a slightly kind of dismal picture, perhaps compared to the situation 2 years on, but broadly representative of the challenge. So I just wanted to, on a slightly brighter note, because I now feel I've been a bit gloomy, just give a couple of quick case studies on some of the ways in which investors are collaborating to drive genuinely meaningful and positive impacts in society. And the first one is the work on living wages. And this is work that we've coordinated, and both the examples are ones that we've coordinated, but I should say that there are many other actors in the space doing really wonderful work, but I'm best equipped to talk about our work, so I'll do that. So for well over a decade now, we have been working with a coalition of civil society organisations, particularly the Living Wage Foundation, but many other players as well. A really fantastic and growing group of institutional investors, pension funds and asset managers and foundations and so on. And then individuals who are completely passionate about companies paying the living wage and have been trained by us to turn up at the annual general meetings of FTSE 100 companies and ask the boards of directors if they would accredit as a living wage employer. And when we started the work, there were 2 accredited living wage employers in the FTSE 100, and now we're over 50%, or 50, so that's really good, and the result of that is that many thousands of people on low pay in these companies and in their immediate supply chain, sort of cleaning and catering and so on, security, are now earning the living wage. So I think that's great, and it's really good evidence that a kind of coordinated approach where you have collaborative groups of investors writing together to companies. The AGM questions are so effective, especially when they're politely delivered. I mean, you know, we're not, our style is not rabble-rousing, but if you're a shareholder in a company and you have the right to go along and physical AGMs, which are just coming back after the pandemic, they're really important occasions. They're very underused. And many of the charities in the room will have investment assets. And if there are companies that you have an interest in their performance in any way, I can really highly recommend putting aside a morning to attend the annual general meeting of that company and put a question, put a proposal, put an idea to them. It's really very effective and has led to lots of change. So we're just upping the ante a little bit with this at the moment by doing something we've never done before in the 12 years on the living wage, which is we put forward a formal shareholder resolution at Sainsbury's, which is the second largest supermarket sector. And we've asked them to accredit as a living wage employer. In the month since we put that resolution forward, everybody at Sainsbury's is now paid the real living wage. But they have not said that they will accredit as a living wage employer. No doubt conscious, as all employers are, including in our sector, about the rising cost of living and the potential bill attached to that. Of course, the flip side is Sainsbury's and any other employer not committing to the living wage. The flip side of that is the insecurity of everybody they employ. So that will go to a vote on the 7th of July. It's quite exciting. And I think it'll be a really interesting test of the UK fund management sector. Where do they stand? Will they back the living wage resolution at Sainsbury's, or will they say no? But the board and management at Sainsbury's have rejected the resolution and recommended that people don't vote for it. So it's going to be quite an interesting little test. So that one is living wages, and I think it's made a real impact. And the other one I want to talk about was tackling the UK's obesity crisis, a programme of work we've been running for a couple of years in partnership with Guy's and St Thomas Foundation, which is a major foundation in the health sector in the UK. Probably many of you know it very well. And what we did was sort of benchmark the biggest supermarkets in the UK, looking at what they did on nutrition, or whether they'd set any targets, what disclosures they had. Because as all of you know, the minute you walk into a supermarket, your choices are being influenced in very subtle ways, or maybe not so subtle, with price promotions on things, with the layout of the store. It's all highly designed, same when you go online. And our choices are being shaped, and that leaves many people quite vulnerable. So, and it's a classic case of, I mean, you'll be well aware that the costs to the NHS, the cost to society of obesity are massive. So it's a classic case of, you know, companies operating a way which is profitable for them, but which externalizes costs onto others. So we built an investor coalition, very excited by the players that we have involved. And then we started interacting with both the supermarket sector, and we're also talking to the major food manufacturers. And we filed another of these pesky shareholder resolutions last year at Tesco, and they stepped up and made a huge commitment, actually, to their very great credit. So Tesco is on a sort of 5-year journey to massively increase the share of its overall food and soft drinks in respect of government-endorsed health standards. So we're really positive about that. We actually withdrew our shareholder resolution. There was no need for it to go to a vote. because the company had stepped up and they'd also committed to being really accountable. So we go and visit Tesco's headquarters, where they have this big laboratory designing everything that you eat when you go to Tesco. It's really interesting trip. And you realise the power of the corporate community to shape our lives and our world, and actually the influence and role that investors and civil society working collaboratively, as we did through this, can play in moving things on in a really positive way. I'm not really going to say too much about this because I'm running out of time, but the Workforce Disclosure Initiative is an initiative that tries to answer the challenge that has been put up about not enough data. So at the moment, the biggest companies in the world tend to report and provide disclosures and data on how they manage their workforce in a very inconsistent, cherry-picking, nice stories kind of way. And what we have done is develop a data framework and a survey that goes to the largest listed companies all across the world, backed by a big group of investors, which is soliciting comparable and much more deep and detailed data sets about how companies manage the workforce. So that's really filling a key gap. So just in conclusion, some thoughts which I hope we can now get into a bit of a debate on, which is, what can civil society do to drive greater impact in this space? One thing obviously you can do, and I haven't put it up here, but perhaps because it's such an obvious thing, but all of our organisations can do better on our own ESG performance, as our environmental footprint typically in our sector is pretty minimal. But there's always room to be better, and it sets an example, and it's positive, and I think people really respond to it. As employers, there are opportunities, of course, to do the right thing. I think I personally think that the sector does its best most of the time. Of course, there are exceptions, but the real exploitation in our economy is not in the third sector. It's in, by the way, we had a very interesting outing to Deliveroo last week. Deliveroo is a company that listed for the first time with an IPO last year. We had highlighted the labour rights issues and the questions for Deliveroo drivers. And to their credit, a large number of big investment firms decided not to invest in Deliveroo off the back of a combination of governance questions they had and concerns, and the labour rights issues that we had. But anyway, the IPO went ahead. It's been badged the most disastrous IPO in British corporate history, because as soon as it IPO'd, the share price slumped dreadfully. But they had their first AGM this year, and a lot of drivers, Deliveroo drivers and bike riders, went along to ask some really pertinent and great questions. And as a result, the board of Deliveroo are under no illusions that investors are really supportive of them having a good story and being able to answer the challenges and questions. So that was really nice to see. And so I think as an employer, obviously there are things that we in the sector can do. But mainly, I want to emphasise, and I have done through this talk, the role that we can play as investors. Many of our charities do have assets, or they have pensions for staff, and there are really big opportunities to make a difference there. And then there are ESG topics where there's such a depth of expertise in the sector. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your stories, but we really know, both from the research that we do in the sector, which is often superb, but also through the direct engagement with people who are in one way or another quite vulnerable. We know the issues, and we should bring that to bear, I think, in a way that's influential on companies and their investors. And obviously ShareAction exists to help with this, so if you are interested, we would love to be working with you. And I've got my colleague Sunniva with me, who is the person in ShareAction that interacts mostly with civil society and really does a great job of bringing them involved, helping them to become involved in this interesting work. So I'll leave it there.